Good evening. My name is Emily Zinn, and I'm the Associate Director of the Carsey-Wolf Center, and it is my great pleasure to welcome actress Robin Weigert to the Pollock Theater to talk about her work on Deadwood. Thank you for coming, Robin. So I want to start first with talking about how you came to Deadwood as a project. I know you were working as a stage actress,
yes.
And then what appealed to you about Deadwood?
Oh, well, I just have to say there was really no chance I was ever going to get this part. I mean, it was I had nothing on tape. You know, I had nothing. I had no reel. I had nothing. I had done one Dick Wolf appearance because he guested here recently. And I was this sort of traumatized witness of a gun shooting in Central Park in an episode of Law & Order, and that was it.
Wow.
That was all I had. And I had done a lot of theater, but in Los Angeles, I don't know that really gets you very far, typically, if that's all you've done. So I was just very lucky with this. I think the material was clearly pretty great.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say this is one of the most expertly written shows. I mean, I didn't really even realize how rare the experience was until I stepped off of that show into the world of just acting for television.
Said, nothing else is written like this.
It was so rare, and what an amazing, essentially, first experience it was, and really a gift. So yeah. It's funny you say what made you respond to the script, as if I'm an A-list actor sitting looking at all these scripts and going, I think maybe I'll choose that one. That was not that time in my life at all. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the idea of being in a Western. So
Yes.
much of the rest of your work has been in urban and suburban settings, but this is a real classic Western in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So what was different about being in a Western than acting in other kinds of shows? And also, what do you think why does the Western continue to appeal to us?
Well, I think this particular Western is David Milch's love letter to America. I mean, it's very, very specific, and it's very unlike other Westerns, although it has some of the tropes and familiar, you know, obviously there's a Wild Bill Hickok and there are all kinds of familiar things, but I think what we're seeing is how out of the soup, the chaos of a sort of lawless place, you sort of necessity have to start to assemble things around a concept of law and order, but it's not like there's law and order first.
Right.
This tense relationship you saw in this episode, which was episode 2, I guess that hasn't been shown to anybody watching on that, but you feel the tension between the lawman and the saloon keeper, who's sort of the saloon keeper, this chaotic man is the organizer of that community at the beginning, even though he's vicious, and he's particularly vicious when we first meet him, you know, and he gets somewhat more civilized as time goes on, and of necessity, because he's forming an alliance with the lawman in order to create a civilization where he can take people's money.
So really the idea that this is about a community sort of constituting itself, figuring out its rules.
Yes, figuring out its rules and figuring out how essentially it can function so that a version of capitalism can function, right? And it's an interesting take on the way we might have begun.
Right.
Right.
And so it seems like the continuing appeal in some way is that we want to keep telling ourselves these stories about.
Well, I think we're trying to understand what we are constantly, and what we are keeps changing. So I think we're actually hungry for narratives right now that give us a better picture of what we are, what we've become, because it's morphing, it's changing. You know, there's right before our eyes, our country's changing significantly. So
having Deadwood get revived in this moment is really an interesting political moment for it to come back.
It was an interesting time to return to it. It was the only time we possibly could return to it when we did the film, and I'm so grateful it was able to happen, just for the sake of closure and us finding each other again. It was a passionate, beautiful experience to come back and be with each other. But it is also an interesting time to return to the Western, to this Western.
Right.
Yeah.
To this question of what constitutes us as a community
Yeah, and of course
Nice.
Hearst, who had gotten to be he was sort of the bad guy who ran off into the sunset, who rode off into the sunset, which is a bit the anti-Western, right? Usually
Right.
the hero wins. And that's where the series had left off, was Hearst sort of won.
Yeah.
And in a way,
Escape.
even though that wasn't when the series was meant to end, what a sort of perfect ending, that the bad guy sort of won, really. But then coming back and getting that just to to tell him off,
Right,
to tell him,
right.
get the hell
To have
out.
him
We're
get
a
his
community.
comeuppance.
We're a community. We love one another. Get the hell out of here. You know, there was something cathartic about doing it. Yeah.
Which we're all kind of hungry for right
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
now.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, coming back around to the beginning of the project for you then, so you were playing a character who is based on a historical figure.
Right.
So what challenges were involved in playing someone who's based on a historical figure, and did you do some research on the historical Jane?
Well,
or-
I love character work best of all things. I mean, I'm not so interested in this.
Yeah.
I'm not so interested in playing myself. So it was a treat to get to, you know, dive off a cliff with her and go somewhere very far, but also very, very near, because there's a version of her certainly in me, which only the people very close to me probably would recognize. So where I first started to find her was in the mirror, off of pictures online that I saw of the historical figure. Obviously, you don't see her moving around or talking.
Right.
But I wanted to match what I saw in the still images, and I used various things from around my apartment to kind of conjure a look that would convince me. And it was a version of making a character that was very outside in. You know, I started with a voice and a thing and threw things out there. And as the series continued, and there was the chance to steepen it more, I think it got more nuanced. And I started to integrate some of David Milch into my characterization.
Really?
Yeah, and I was able to do that because he was often creating in the moment. He would come and lines would be created, or the scene would be worked upon with him. It was very he was very active with us.
Right.
You know, he would come and milch the scene. Whoever the director was, he would come and join us and say profound and incredible things. So, you know, sometimes going back to the beginning of all time, you know, that would give us deeper layers of the scenes. But anyway, he would portray Jane sometimes just in the process of doing that. And there were things he brought to her that I started to poach. Yeah.
Wow.
There was a kind of pretzeling he did physically, a kind of a pretzeling around himself in a way that the hands were, and I found things from that little, and something in the movie, you know, you want to fight about it, there was something, a thing that he might do. I just kept finding little bits of him in her.
Nice.
And that was a lot of fun to keep growing it over time, and probably elements of myself were finding they were in there too. I think the beauty of a series in general, if a showrunner is really involved that way, is that it can come to the actors, and the actors can come to it. You know,
Interesting.
It's a living, growing thing, and little things that you bring, little unexpected things about yourself that you might reveal, will get woven in as it goes. Unlike a film script, which exists before you showed up, right?
So in some ways, your Jane portrayal became more you as it went along, and
more
it
me.
created
It
parts
became
of
more
you and
more
David Milch.
David. It became more everything as time went on. I think she was meant to be gone by whatever it was, episode 8.
Oh.
I think so. I think she was meant to leave town, and that was that. And that just didn't happen, thank God. Yeah, it just kept going. So,
That's really
yeah.
interesting. So you used the photographs of the historical Jane, and she was photographed a lot. Like she
She
liked to be photographed and to
Well, I think it's also how she
pose.
managed to make her way in the world at a certain point. She made a profession of being her. You
Right.
know, she wrote a pamphlet about her exploits, or had one written, whatever it was, and advertised herself. And I think it was a way of getting invited places and get her drinks paid for, and you know,
Selling
and
her
have a
image.
road show for a while with Buffalo Bill Cody, and you know, she became a figure, and it was partly her own doing that she became such a figure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And this more theatrical her is a little bit suggested, certainly it's in the costume in the movie, because she hadn't obviously become that yet. She's a honking mess there, but
Right.
you know, she rides back into town with this plumage and a bit of a splash of green, and you know,
She's a little more
some
groomed
color
up
and-
there.
Yeah. So
Oh, fascinating. So I wanted to talk a little more about how you think about the process of embodying Jane physically. Like, are there specific things you think about doing with your body and your voice when you become Jane?
it's an interesting question that I'm not sure how to answer. I mean, I think she just became that, but it was a layered becoming. Like it
Right.
It's funny to watch episode 2, because I see things about how I was characterizing her then that were just the beginning of it. But it as a matter of fact, I remember doing this episode and being in a bit of crisis about the fact that she'd fallen apart so completely, because I had
Right.
I had in my mind a version of her that was much tougher than that, and then letting her just sort of shatter like that. I thought, who could she be? And there was another who could she be moment, which was when Bill Hickok died.
Right.
I thought, who the hell can Jane be without Bill? That's it. That's
And then-
her whole beating heart was him. Like, who could she
And she
become?
keeps having to
now?
reassemble herself.
And so I did reassemble her multiple times around multiple things over the course of this series, I guess. So who she is now, and now I'm 50. You know, that's a very different age than that was for all of us. And so there's also something about this age that I am that found its way into the character now. And this age is really a moment where you realize your life is going to be what your choices are absolutely defining.
Right.
And you either muster and go after that thing that you needed your life to be, or your life will take another turn,
different path.
and you'll be the sadder for it, you know. But I think you recognize that everything has consequences at this age, whereas
Right.
then you're molten and
Sort of flailing around.
flailing
in some
about,
way.
trying to figure out, what am I? Am I this? Am I this? Am I this? Am I this? You know, this is an age of choice.
Right.
So,
Which it
yeah.
seems like at the beginning of the movie. I mean, she's making this choice to come back into
Yes.
town and find Joni. And
right,
she's,
right. And I think that was very well sort of understood or observed, you know, like by the creator of the show. It's now or never, you know.
Right.
She's either going to claim her love, or she could just go down that alcoholic path and just die.
Right.
So
Yeah, so that is a place that the story departs from the historical Jane, right? That she finds
she did
this-
die a pretty
she
sad
finds this
death.
connection. And
Yeah, I mean, I think the beautiful contradiction in her, though, must have been to some extent true of the real woman, because so many people attended her funeral.
Right.
She must have had a lot of love to give and have distributed it pretty liberally, in spite of being such a hope to die drunk.
yeah,
you
this
know.
just an incredible, charismatic person.
And I think how she was during the plague, I think that was real. I think she had no thought to herself and just she didn't hold herself above anyone, which is actually allows somebody to be quite extraordinary.
Right.
Because she was so lowly in her own eyes, she could
Right.
show up for everybody.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, about, you know, Jane as caregiver in
Yeah.
this series. I think it's really interesting. And one of my favorite moments in this particular episode is that scene at the end of it where Jane and Charlie are in the wagon with Sophia, and they're trying to sing around to her. And it's this moment of real tenderness. And for me, it really echoed the moment in the pilot when Bill is in the wagon and he has a headache, and Jane is
it's just melting with love.
right.
Yeah,
that moment,
soft.
where like her solicitousness and tenderness toward him, which contrasts so much with her stomping around and yelling at everyone else, right? So you could can you talk a little bit about Jane as a caregiver and how the series uses her moments of tenderness?
Well, I mean, maybe from the people you know in your own life, certainly from the people I know in my life, it's often the tenderest people who have to build up the toughest veneer,
Right.
because there's so much to protect. That little girl she's protecting here is some version of herself, you know, and I think it's not much of a stretch to imagine that the real Jane was pretty badly violated as a young
Right.
child and person. I mean, she was on her own from a very young age, and the damage is so clear and all of that. But I think her capacity to love is both what wounds her the most and also her salvation. You know, she clearly has a big heart, right? And then you just throw a ton up in the way of it, so nobody can come and hurt it.
Right.
Right, and it's that tension that sort of makes this person, this character.
The sort of
Yeah.
boundaries that she's throwing up
Yeah,
around
huge.
herself.
You know, don't mess with me, and it just shatters in a moment. You know, blow her over with a feather, kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I also was wondering about the process of sort of makeup and hair and wardrobe for this character, and if there were ways in which it's distinct from your other experiences in entertainment, because you're normally so lovely and put together, and in this you're really grubby. Was there still a big, long process of
Janie
assembling
Bryant
Jane?
was the costume designer, and she also did the costumes for Mad Men. And
Oh.
she's really brilliant. You know, I think nobody here feels like a stock character. Nobody's costumed in a generic way.
Right.
Everybody's got little signature things all over, you know, in terms of how she outfits them. And the hat was a big one for me. It wasn't a cool hat. This one, you know, the hat I got to ride back into town with was kind of, you know,
Had a swishy feather on
yeah.
and-
But this hat was too tall and had to be punched in and all of that. And at first I was like, I'm not sure that's her hat, you know. I think she looks cooler than that. And actually it was the perfect thing for her. There were just so many little. It's the oversized, weighted down feeling, that big, roomy coat she wears, and everything.
Oh, and
just
how
feels-
you hooch it
everything,
up every
well,
time.
it's always fallen off, and you know, it's all very hot because we shot in Santa Clarita, baking sun of summer sometimes, and it was a lot to contend with the heat under all of that. I was better off than the women who had to wear corsets, but you know,
Right.
it's like, yeah.
This
so-
episode in particular, everyone looks really hot.
Is that right? I don't remember what time of year we did this, but that episode. But I do think it was still quite baking hot summer. And actually in the Doc's place, like that little hut had to be lit from the inside, and then you'd add to that 102-degree weather outside.
Oh.
Right? And so it was this tiny little incubator. But that sort of sweaty, intense feeling was what it felt like to be dealing with sickness and death and danger. So it worked.
And being
in our
threatened by
favor.
Alice Warringen, right? I mean,
Sure.
so this is, you don't have a lot of scenes where you overlap with him too tightly in this show. Like, he's not often in the same space as you. What was it like playing
Working
off
with
of
Ian,
that
you mean?
character?
Yeah. Well, Ian is wonderful, and he's a wonderful person too. He's a great guy, and the sense of menace. I feel like it's characters like that and Tony Soprano, and
Yes.
we have all collectively fallen in love with the anti-hero, and current events would suggest we may have fallen a little too hard for the anti-hero.
Yes.
But you know, like I think that there's something so seductive about that kind of guy.
Yes.
Just,
Well, in that moment when you're in that small space being menaced by him, it feels like it changes your perspective on him. That, you know, Jane, who
and
we already
she's-
love.
He's hitting her trigger point the moment he steps in. You know, there's some association between him,
Right.
for the character, between him and something from her past. She just can smell it. She knows, and she had been so confident moments
Right.
before that she could fend off anybody, and in a moment she's dismantled. And I think that's, a lot to deal with.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it's a
Yeah.
really intense moment in this episode.
Sure. Yeah.
I also think this episode is great for the way it exposes Jane's relationship with Charlie Utter. So can you talk a little bit about Jane's relationship with Charlie and working with Dayton Callie?
Yeah, and he's still a friend. You know, Dayton is still in my life. A lot of these people are still very much in my life. But no, I think the mutual love for Bill, at least in this beginning chapter, Bill is so much the glue between us, and Dayton's character is you know, a grumpy caretaker himself. He can't resist trying to save, help. He may make him miserable, but that's seems to be one of his organizing principles. You know, so I guess we sort of have that in common as characters, and. I love working with all of these people so much, and the relationships between the characters are so specific. I think when we all reassembled around the table, even though I knew everybody in real life and we had friendships and relationships in real life, sitting back down at the table to read the pilot together was so emotional because it was a re-encounter with the characters.
Oh,
who
when
I
you
hadn't
came
seen,
back to the movie,
yeah,
yes.
I hadn't seen those people, even though I'd seen the people who play them
Right.
for a dozen years. And there they all were again. And I feel that way about Charlie Utter. You know, he's Dayton, but he's also Charlie.
Oh.
I mean,
And such the heart of, you know, in particular the
yeah.
movie, that the whole movie centers around this tragedy of
Bill.
Yeah.
Or Charlie's
Of the
death.
loss-
Oh yeah, yeah.
loss
no,
of Charlie,
the movie.
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
excellent. So I'm also interested in knowing, just hypothetically, you know, it seems like there are certain characters that Jane didn't interact with that much in the series. If the series had continued on, what characters would you have liked to see her interact with?
Well, the sad thing about the series having ended when it did is that there was so much potential all over the place.
Right.
I loved getting to, for example, dip into what the relationship might be with Alma, because we're
Yeah.
so different. But we forged an alliance around the girl. We
Right.
almost don't even speak the same language. But there's this sort of womanly, energetic, sort of reaching out across this huge divide, behavior, class, status, everything, you know.
But through this caregiving.
Yeah, and the scenes that were written where there's a total disconnect in terms of the language being spoken, and yet people are finding each other. I loved those scenes, and I loved the way they were written too. There were ones with, gosh, so many. There were so many that played like that for Jane, because she's so rough
Right.
that she doesn't have a great way of sort of meeting people where they live in terms of the wish is there, you know,
Right.
to speak their language, to tune in, to understand. But whenever she's hanging out with somebody, it's this.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah,
love the way she has of coming into spaces and announcing herself in this
Sure.
way that, like,
Yeah.
you know, where she can't connect just with one individual immediately. She has to kind of make this announcement and then have the space come to her in that way. Yeah, no, she's a
There's
fascinating
a lot of
character.
self-protection in that kind of behavior too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the one character who was the one relationship that becomes so important in the movie and that isn't really spotlighted yet in this episode is the one with Joni, of course. And
Sure.
so can you talk a little bit about the process of developing that relationship and you know, working with Kim Dickens?
Yeah, well, Kim is wonderful to work with, and that developed kind of late. What I remember is that the seeds of it were there, but there had to be a decision in the writer's room to sort of go for that. And then I
Right.
think some scenes were, because we had the luxury at HBO with this, of sort of shooting pretty much the whole thing, and then it went on the screen, as opposed to sort of, it's always being churned out
Oh, I
and in
see.
front of an audience, and then you do the next one. What I believe happened, and I may be remembering it wrong, is that that storyline was introduced, and then some scenes were written back into episodes that already seems
Existed.
to be complete.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, to sort of carry the through line, and how great. I mean, I don't know that many shows have that luxury,
Right.
Right. So, Charlie is the engine of the. Charlie has a crush on Joni, but he's the engine of bringing them together because he sees two wounded souls who might be able to benefit from each other. And I do think maybe we all connect at our wounded places, actually,
right.
most deeply, and that is how they first come together. Joni's at her absolute nadir, and strangely, Jane has something to offer,
right?
And just has an instinct for it. She thinks she's a piece of, but she's going to offer what she can, and
right.
lo and behold,
that caregiving, like the past tense, she's
yeah.
able to offer something to Joni. Yeah, it's just such a lovely relationship, and seeing it get revived in the movie was really.
It sort of organizes around that,
And I'm wondering too, having seen the movie, I'm interested in the way you approach playing a character with alcoholism. That I appreciate the fact that the series never succumbed to the temptation to miraculously fix Jane, to have her.
It would have been very ahistorical if they had.
Sober up, right? I mean, the historical Jane did not, and so and right at the beginning of the movie, she's drinking again. So can you talk a little bit about the process of playing a character who has such a long-standing problem with alcohol?
Well, I would, I'm maybe taking my answer in a different direction than you're guiding me, but I think so much of David with this because he spoke of addiction as a thwarted reaching out for God, which maybe, I don't know much about AA, and I don't know if that's some kind of trope, but it felt like the words were coming from him. And I do think he had a pretty deep understanding of what addiction stands in for people, which is why so many poets and artists and, people who actually deeply have a lot to offer succumb to addiction because there's something passionate and thwarted that needs expression, and it's reaching out for something,
that they're not they're not achieving.
And so I just think our showrunner, our creator, and maybe our creator, has very compassionate view of people who suffer from addictions, and it's all over the show.
Right, absolutely. All those people whose hands are shaking while they're reaching
Alma
for coffee.
And, everyone. And everybody has their different ways of dealing with it. Alma's very proud about it and has to be do it sleight of hand. And the more rough characters are just balls out with it. But it sort of seems to afflict many of the people in that, and maybe all the people in that world to some extent. Deal with it, and I think we deal with it as a country. I think, again, if you look at this sort of as a microcosm or a little petri dish where you can look at America, I think we deal with it as a country.
And to sort of say how we're all being...
The promise of America is so big that there's very little... the chance of our lives living up to the American dream, it was small even before we became an oligarchy. It was like really small. And so the sense of great hope, great ambition, great longing, great yearning, desire to be your absolutely best self, and then the difference between that and what you really are, I think drives people to drink. Drives people to substance abuse at sort of epidemic proportions, right? So there's a lot. I know that's a big answer to a pretty...
That's a great answer,
you
though.
were asking me an actor question, and I gave you a bigger answer. But I think, as far as playing it, I can't... I have no tolerance. I have a glass of wine, and the next day is hard. So but sometimes I'd be playing these scenes for a long time because you do shoot them much longer than they end up, and I would feel drunk by the end. There's some power of suggestion. put it into my brain that I'd been drinking, and I really started to feel like I had been, to the point where driving home sometimes felt dangerous. It's weird. It was as if my chemistry was off. Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So I don't know what that is. That's a, I don't know what that is. Yeah.
It's another kind of thwarted reaching.
Something. It's something kooky about acting. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh dear.
So.
So, as Patrice mentioned in our opening, we had Dick Wolf here recently.
Yeah,
he talked about
so
David
cool.
Milch
Yeah.
as the one genius he'd met in television. So I wonder if you can talk, I know you've been talking all the way through about the process of working with Milch, but I wonder if you want to say more about what it was like to work with him and what you learned from that process.
You can probably tell already, hearing me tell how much love I feel for him, and I mean, so genius, brilliant, and all of that is very important. But equally important is that he has such a capacious love for all of us as actors, for the people he works with as writers. He's just incredible. He'd build a family out of who he was working with always, it felt, and a teacher always, also. Like, there wasn't a context you could be with David where you weren't sort of like also his student, felt like. So anybody who got to be in the writer's room had that gift. Anybody who got to work with him as an actor had that gift. And I think we were all so hungry for it on the movie too. But there was a little less of David on offer just because he was sick at the time. But you know, it was this like, oh, please, can we just sit at your feet some more, a little more, and get a little more of that great stuff. And it would come through in these incredible bursts in the film. He would come and read prepared remarks to us at the beginning of a day's work often, and his wife Rita lovingly put them together into a little booklet that she gave out as a cast gift at the end. But like, I remember at the beginning of a day of work on the film, he quoted the E. Cummings poem, Buffalo Bill's defunct. Do you know that one? Who used to ride a water smooth stallion, kill 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. I think I've got it a little wrong. Jesus, he was a handsome man, and what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? Right. So these would be the kind of little gems.
Right.
And you take that in your heart, and then and it would just do whatever work it would do, and then you would work.
Right.
Right. So they were these little gifts, and it would just sort of be dropped into your to you as an actor, and then you'd act, and somehow sort of it would be working inside of you. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That was a version of what he did back when we did the series. But those he would come and just speak volubly, and off the cuff. But the same idea. He might talk about something in the Bible, or he might, talk about some poetry, or Robert Penn Warren was a favorite professor of his, and so there might be some beautiful offering from Robert Penn Warren that would start the day.
So just setting the expectation that you would translate that into your work then.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even call it an expectation. It was just sort of like, here you go, and then the work would somehow take on a life because of that. And watching this again after so long, I haven't seen this in so long, the sense of a cohesive world is so there to me. Like, everybody was doing their beautiful separate work, but like, it's very much a place where they're all in the same world. All those people up there are in the same world. And, that was director by director. So, shows do develop their own tone, and then directors will come in and direct episode by episode and give their little spin on it.
Right, their own flair,
right?
Sure.
Their flavor. This was Davis Guggenheim, which is, he went on to do some other kind of work.
Yes.
But David would always pull it back to some essential set of things that I think made the show feel so of a piece.
Right.
Right? No, so no matter which director came in, there was a quality where he would take it and bring it to a certain essence that was David.
And creating that connective tissue among
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm saying it well, but yeah, he would some piece of him was in every single thing. And people and directors would come and sort of rise to the occasion, but they would also step aside, and David would come and speak, and then they would step back in again.
Wow.
You know, it was like that. So
that just sounds like a fascinating experience,
and
especially
unique.
as an early experience in this form for you.
And so unique that I sort of then expected it of my next showrunner, who wasn't, you know, like that at all. Just this whole way of being. He was off doing his writing, and directors would come in and direct. And I was like, where is he? Why isn't he here telling us?
Where's the nugget?
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Well, so before we turn to questions from the audience, I wanted to be sure to be able to ask you about some of the most recent work you've been doing, which is as a director. So can you talk a little bit about the short film that you have just directed?
I mean, there's been some interesting other acting work too.
Right.
That, you know, but this short was a like I loved the experience on Big Little Lies. That was also, you know, in a very different way, comparably super interesting.
Let's do the Big Little Lies question first.
We don't have to do it first.
Okay.
I can talk about the film.
Well, then someone in the audience ask about Big Little Lies.
No, you don't have to. But the short, I made a New Year's resolution at the beginning of last year that I wanted to try on being a leader rather than a follower, because there's something beautiful about being an actor and sort of being a vessel for all these things, to suggestions to come in and then you just manifest them or whatever. But I wanted to see what it would be like to take the reins of something. And more and more, actually, as I get older, I start to have directorial thoughts, impulses. Sometimes have to bite my tongue, you know. And so I thought, let's see what it feels like. And of course, it's not a totally representative, like doing a short, you're putting together everything on such a shoestring budget, and you're doing it quickly, and the crew probably hasn't worked together before, and so you're dealing with maybe more obstacles than you would if you had a well-oiled machine.
Sure.
You know,
your team.
but even that is super useful. One of the best leadership lessons I learned was when to totally hand it over to the more experienced DP and say, how do we solve this?
Wow.
Because it was I had planned maybe 3 or 4 times more shots than we had time for. I mean, there was no question. So at a certain point, I was reduced to saying, okay, you know, sun is setting. We have to get all of this stuff that I had planned for these 5 angles in this one angle. So where do we put the camera? You know, and how, you know, like I just had to hand it over a couple times. Or can we do this with handheld or what, you know, like just stuff. It was
an essential part of leadership is knowing when to hand
knowing when
it over
to delegate responsibility and when to be humble enough to say I have no clue, and which is why I so love Elizabeth Warren. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, I think not to get political, but yeah, is to be able to say, you know, you may know better. What do you have to say about that? I'm
Deferring
listening.
to someone else's
I'm listening to you.
expertise.
Yeah, I'm listening to you, because I recognize things about myself and things about you that. So that was really very humbling and cool. And I love being able to have those conversations that you have with a designer and with, you know, costume designer, and enter into it through their lens and see how they were looking at it and come up with a vocabulary. The hardest part for me was talking with the composer of the score, because music is so ineffable and you know, how to find language to say what I hoped the music would lift up and out in the story, and then the passing back and forth. He'd give me a scored version. I'd say, oh, I'm feeling it's a little horror movie-ish. Like what, you know, how do we, what it really is he's feeling afraid. We shouldn't be afraid of him. Like how do I, you know, like that kind of conversation. It's just, it was all so interesting, and
learning a new language in some ways.
Yes, yeah, and hopefully thinking, okay, next time I can apply some of this better, because it was very first-timey. And stuff like, you know, going on instinct, I wasn't always tempted to start with the wide and move in. I was happy to hear Jay Roach say he doesn't always start with the wide, because I thought I'm breaking every rule of, but filmmaking, but sometimes I knew I would just want to be in, you know, and that there was more intrigue in just being in, and we didn't need to know where we were in space and time. Anyway, it was a wonderful first plunge, and I'm actually into re-editing it now. I had done a pass with an editor. Who you collaborate with is so important, and I'd done a pass with an editor who's brilliant and who I couldn't totally bridge the gap in communication with. It was just, and I've just started working a little bit with another editor who I'm like, oh, I think we actually speak the same language, and this is, you know, so, but I'm not casting aspersions on anyone. I mean, she was extraordinary, but like it just, that, if I ever direct again, would be, I understand why directors accrue people that they work with over and over.
Once your visions are aligned, yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So is it an experience you want to have again? Are you interested in directing again?
I think so. I think that I would be interested in trying to really totally create something. I mean, you know, see what it would be like even more, but to totally create something from scratch would be really interesting, which I didn't do in this case. So that's sort of the next challenge, you know. So
excellent. Well, we can't wait to
Thank you.
see what turns up.
Thank you.
So we have some time for some questions from the audience.
So you had mentioned earlier on the beauty of sort of working in a serial medium in terms of television, where you get to kind of connect with the character.
Yeah.
And especially at HBO, where there's that freedom.
Yeah.
I was just curious about the connection there with your stage work from earlier on, where you're sort of doing the same thing over and over. Right. Is that another medium where you're able to connect with that character in a way, or is it completely different because you're not moving forward at all? I was just curious about that connection.
Theater used to be what I sort of lived for. I mean, really, and I wish this wasn't true, but I've a little fallen out of love with it. I hope I fall back in love with it again. But I think it started to feel like, certainly in New York, like people were going because they'd read the review and of something, and it was like ticking off the boxes, like, oh, I saw that hit show, you know, and I wasn't feeling the sense of visceral connection that I would have wished that made theater feel so alive to me. And as an audience member, I'm always looking for that too. When I go to see plays, I'm asking myself, is this really connecting with us? Are we really connecting with this? Is it really feeling alive in here? Or is it feeling like this thing has been lauded and the audience is coming because they're coming to a cultural event and they've spent a ton of money and they want it to be worth it, so they're laughing really loud and they're, you know, is it actually happening? I just have always had this real desire to connect. And weirdly, because television was always being turned off in my household growing up, like it was, if it was like, you know, the enemy of thought. My dad would come in and off it would go. But I do feel like certain shows are really connecting. Who knew, right, that this medium would sort of evolve into something like this? But like when that's happening, I'm very excited by television. When it happens in a movie, I'm very excited by a movie. I'm just looking for it wherever it is, a feeling that it can wake people up, which is, I think, what it's for. I mean, some of it's to put people to sleep, but I think it's to wake people up. So, yeah. It's not really an answer to your question, is it? But, yeah. So, and then we all have to make a living too. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. Can you see me? I can see you. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to ask the Big Little Lies question.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
So, you talked about, you know, kind of exploring alcoholism or alcohol dependency, and then in Big Little Lies, you get to explore domestic abuse, domestic violence, and your role is so challenging. I remember watching it, and there's just these moments where I don't know if you're so restrained, and I think you're trying to be this mirror, and you're trying to push her and encourage her to see kind of the toxicity of the relationship, but you have such a tenderness and a patience. I just wonder what that was like for you, if it felt frustrating. There was times watching it where I wanted to be like, tell her to leave him. And you do in your own way, but I mean, you really help her.
That's therapy.
Yeah, no, but you did a great job of kind of portraying that in this very reserved and compassionate way. And I just wonder if you could comment on that and how that related maybe to the experience of experiencing Jane and kind of going through that journey too.
Yeah, I mean,
You've got this very
polar
self-help.
opposite extremes of
Yeah.
something, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what was so beautiful there was that it really felt like something was happening in the room, and I, for whatever reason, was taking very seriously the therapist's charge of like, you know, don't trigger a fight or flight reaction, you know, let's stay with her here in this delicate space. And you could feel how volcanic it was for her. So it was less restraint than trying to sort of manage, in a way, the objective, right? Which is to bring her to a place where she can extricate herself. And especially in the first season, there's really this sense that she's walking a very, in a way, even for her, dangerous line. She's with a very intelligent woman who's a lawyer and who understands, you know, that there's places that I could go that would maybe be breaking my own oath. But at a certain point, when there's real danger to the patient, a doctor does need to cross that line, you know, and sizing up how real that danger is part of the job too. Right? Even in terms of informing other people of things that are supposed to be secret. If there's real danger, it's incumbent upon you to do that too, right? So the fact that she's walking that line is part of what makes those scenes very taut and interesting, even though there is restraint, as you say. And Nicole is wonderful to work with. It was fun to work with her again in Bombshell, in a very different pair of roles. I mean, in a way, I'm helping her again, but this lawyer, Nancy Erica Smith, that I got to play, is so very different than that therapist. She's sort of a cheerful warrior who, you know, is you know, do I want to take on this client? Are we going to win this battle? Okay, all right, we can do. You know, it's the confidence of her is kind of great. But she was very, very different. And I felt very, very different. And even our way of working was very different. And it was wonderful to have that with the same actress. We could actually talk between scenes on that one. Whereas in Big Little Lies, we never broke character, really. It's like between takes, she would often sort of pace and look, you know, stare me down or whatever. It was just staying inside the roles and managing that tension was awesome. So, I'd love to work with her again. I mean, I think she's just a very interesting actress. So that was a gift. Jean-Marc Vallée was very interesting as a director. And that's so much a part of an experience as well. So there's so many aspects to it, right? It's not what you do, it's what's happening. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well,
Yeah.
please join me in thanking Robin Weigert for such a fascinating evening.
Thank you.